What's up, everyone? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. As the media shifts its focus from ISIS militants to Ebola to George Clooney's wedding, people seem to have largely forgotten about a dire human rights situation in another corner of the world. Guantanamo Bay Prison is still holding 149 men indefinitely. 143 of them have never been levied charges nor faced trial and have been rotting behind concrete walls for years. Historically, the only avenue for prisoners to get attention to their struggle is by going on a hunger strike. And there have already been 2 mass hunger strikes at the prison, the second involving up to 106 prisoners at its height in 2013. This, plus news that at least 45 of the men were being routinely force-fed, propelled the story into international headlines, causing the government to re-strategize. So they turned to euphemisms, calling it a long-term non-religious fast. Furthermore, daily briefs were no longer issued concerning the amount of men on the strike, and tapes of the dehumanizing procedure remain classified. Force-feeding prisoners is considered a violation of international law under the Tokyo Convention. And according to Yemeni prisoner Ahmad Hassan, the process is akin to torture. He describes that detainees are strapped in what's called a torture chair, given laxatives while being force-fed excess liquid through oversized tubes that are repeatedly shoved through their nostrils. Now, after deafening silence on behalf of Guantanamo officials and the White House about this daily violation of medical ethics, Obama's finally asked a judge to hold a long-awaited hearing on the procedure. Big problem, though. Mr. Transparency wants it all done in secret, 'cause national security. According to The Guardian, should the judge approve the government's request, the first major legal battle over force feeding in a federal court would be less transparent than the military commissions at Guantanamo Bay. Look, the same judge has already shown where her allegiance lies by preventing the release of the classified tapes of the force feedings. Clearly, there's a lot to hide here. And this latest measure is just another move to silence the plight of these men. But if public pressure continues to mount, they can't keep this egregious practice in the shadows forever. Let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set.
Since March of this year, the city of Detroit has been rocked by an underreported human rights crisis. See, an estimated 22,000 people have been left without access to potable water simply because they were behind on their payments. This according to Detroit's Water and Sewage Department. Now, city officials claim that the shutoffs are necessary because of the dire financial situation of the local economy, as Detroit recently filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. To them, the logic is simple. If you can't pay your bills, then you shouldn't get water. Well, a short-lived moratorium put a stop to mass shutoffs earlier this summer, but only after a wave of protests as well as widespread condemnation from groups like the NAACP, Amnesty International, and even the UN, which said that cutting water to the poorest residents of Detroit is a violation of human rights. But with little being done to fix the problem, grassroots organizations have been working hard to empower residents from the ground up. One such activist is Makita Taylor of the Detroit Water Brigade, who says that not thinking of water as a human right is beyond comprehension.
Anyone who would equate a life with a payment of a bill, that's just really difficult for me to understand. I wouldn't teach my children that. You know, that if someone is hungry, you leave them hungry because they don't have food, or if someone needs a life survival, something that keeps them alive, you're going to deny them that because of a piece of paper called money. I really find that difficult to understand. But I do know that there are people in the world who feel that way. And, you know, what can you do about that? Is that the predominant attitude of most Americans? That's the question that I've been asking.
Taylor's organization has been so successful in raising awareness about the plight of thousands of underprivileged Detroiters that it's captured the support of at least one U.S. lawmaker. In response to the crisis, Michigan Congressman John Conyers said actions that deny residents the ability to bathe, hydrate, or prepare meals for themselves and their families create costly, long-term public health challenges. These water cutoffs are not only inhumane, but economically short-sighted. See, this issue is not nearly as simple as unpaid bills. Detroit residents are also plagued with skyrocketing unemployment and the remnants of a financial crisis that's left 1 in 5 individuals with homes in foreclosure, a recipe for disaster in a city that's already affected by widespread poverty. Unfortunately, despite the international attention and grassroots mobilization, a judge overseeing the city's bankruptcy case just cemented the notion that water is not a human right, ruling that the shutoffs can continue as long as residents aren't paying for the product. See, that's what this has become. In one of capitalism's sacrifice zones, a resource vital to the survival of all living things is considered just another commodity. And as long as this society keeps treating water as a product that can be privatized instead of shared among the commons, we have zero moral high ground to impose humanitarian ideals on anyone else. As the 2014 UN General Assembly comes to an end, world leaders are giving themselves a pat on the back for attempting to tackle every problem from climate change to Ebola. But perhaps no achievement has been highlighted more by diplomats than an anti-terrorism resolution unanimously passed by the Security Council last week. All 15 members of the Council approved Resolution 2178, which condemns violent extremism and calls for member states to prevent funding for terrorists and crack down on their ability to travel. Sounds common sense enough. After all, who wouldn't get behind condemning terrorism? But some civil liberty advocates are concerned that the resolution contains similar elements as the USA Patriot Act, a 9/11 piece of legislation that codified much of the mass surveillance state and Fourth Amendment violations we see today. And despite these concerns, there's been virtually no scrutiny of the vagueness of the resolution's language and its specific provisions. So here to discuss how this resolution could change the behavior of world governments, I'm joined now by RT correspondent Marina Portnaya. Marina, let's start by outlining exactly what UN Resolution 2178 calls for with regards to restricting international travel and enhancing global surveillance.
Well, Abby, the resolution requires all UN member states to take a series of measures to prevent the movement and recruitment of foreign terrorist fighters. So, for example, law enforcement agents now have the authority to prevent and suppress what they deem as recruiting, organizing, transporting, or equipping of individuals who travel to a foreign country for the purpose of committing terrorist attacks. Officials can prevent people from traveling if they have, quote, credible information that provides reasonable grounds, unquote. But what that actually means, we don't know because that statement wasn't defined in the resolution.
Extremely interesting there, because all we heard was kind of a round of applause that everyone can agree to this one measure, Marina. And considering that the UN is only as powerful as the member states that make it up, does this resolution actually have any legal backing behind it? And why do you think it was passed unanimously without much debate?
Oh, make no mistake, this resolution has a lot of backing, and it is legally binding because it was adopted by the UN Security Council. That means violating this resolution would be a violation of international law. You have to consider the climate under which the resolution was unanimously adopted. We just saw the U.S.-led coalition of airstrikes against Iran and Syria begin. The U.S. says it was to target Islamic State militants. Europe also just announced that 3,000 of its citizens have traveled overseas to join ISIS. The U.S. says at least 100 Americans have done the same. So with the fear over these foreign terrorist fighters growing, what country wants to be the one to veto or vote against a resolution that's allegedly aimed at combating an international threat? So here we have clearly all these countries of the Security Council agreeing on a text.
And so let's talk about the concerns here. Why are civil liberties advocates concerned with the text?
Well, Abby, if you read the text of the resolution, it requires governments to grant law enforcement authorities a wider scope to monitor and suppress the travel and other activities of suspected foreign terrorists. But how each country defines potential terrorists or jihadists is different. This could allow countries to monitor more people in the name of international security. Additionally, Human Rights Watch says the resolution is rampant with potential due process violations because the text doesn't articulate the process in which suspects would be denied their right to travel. And some critics say the some provisions of the resolution actually promote the idea that people can be prosecuted for their thoughts and beliefs, but not their actions. So basically, this resolution does not specifically detail what exact criminal conduct is a prerequisite for detention.
You bring up a really good point, which is that it's kind of all up to the discretion of these member states, Marina, of what deems a terrorist threat or extremist thought, radicalization. Of course, there's also worries from some advocacy groups about racial profiling, but it does say specifically that it would not base stereotypical profiling prohibiting travel. Is there any reason why those people should be concerned?
Well, yes, of course, the resolution does say that there should be no racial profiling used at all. But according to foreign policy, one provision in the resolution encourages states to employ what's called evidence-based traveler risk assessment and screening procedures. That means that they could include a traveler's previous itinerary for potential grounds for detention. That means that if an immigrant is visiting a family somewhere in the Middle East or North Africa, they're more likely to be stopped and questioned at the airport than someone that's visiting maybe the UK, for example. One counterterrorism expert has predicted that the resolution's warning to avoid racial profiling will be ignored and that more people with long beards and skull caps will be taken out of line at airports than the guy wearing, a polo shirt or a suit and tie.
Right. I mean, of course, we hear that with stop and frisk, right? No, it's not racial profiling, but then you look at the actual statistics, and of course, that's what's going to be happening. Though, of course, there's also concerns that this resolution could be used for an excuse to implement repressive measures on populations as well. Why?
Well, because the resolution could end up giving states new tools to crack down on separatist groups or dissidents or activists by actually branding them as terrorists. Because critics say the text of the resolution, it is vague enough that it leaves it up to each country to decide who to target. Think about countries like Bahrain or Saudi Arabia who are already squashing political opposition groups. The fear is that now those said governments and other governments too, we shouldn't just limit it to them. It could be any country, can label anyone who's an inconvenience to them as a foreign terrorist fighter or suspected foreign terrorist fighter.
Marina, it's a shame that kind of ISIS has overshadowed the intense scrutiny over the NSA surveillance program that we've been seeing in years past. It's just really unfortunate that they're using this as kind of a linchpin to crack down even more. Thank you so much for bringing attention to it, Marina Portnoy. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Abby.
Coming up, I'll talk about California's positive environmental move. Stay tuned.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
In a groundbreaking new move, yesterday, California Governor Jerry Brown signed an unprecedented law that bans single-use plastic bags at grocery and convenience stores. California is now the first state in the entire country to enact such a ban, which completely replaces plastic at the checkout counter and requires store clerks to charge shoppers 10 cents to use paper bags instead. After signing the legislation, Governor Brown added that, quote, "The bill is a step in the right direction. It reduces the torrent of plastic polluting our beaches, parks, and even the vast ocean. We're the first to ban these bags, and we won't be the last." Every year, the Golden State throws away over 13 billion plastic bags, amounting to 123,000 tons of waste. Wow, according to the nonprofit group Environment California. This means that in terms of pollution reduction, the new state law is certainly a welcome relief. So to go over just a few of the details of the new law, I'm joined by RT correspondent Lindsay France from LA. Lindsay, let's talk about when the new plastic bag ban takes effect, and does it apply to all plastic bags?
Well, Abby, we're going to see starting next summer, actually, the large stores like Walmart and Target, along with major grocery stores, completely switching. And then after that, about a year after that, it'll be convenience stores and pharmacies. Now, small plastic bags are not the equal of the take-home plastic bags you see now in grocery stores. So things that hold vegetables and meats will still be out there for use. But these are, we're talking about the stuff you get at the checkout counter, of course. In California here, this has already been in practice in many counties for a while. I've been living here a month. I have yet to see a plastic bag in a grocery store, and I'm already using reusable.
Right, we're talking about those plastic bags that are just littered beaches, rivers everywhere. It's insane. I'm really happy that this is happening statewide, and it sounds great. Of course, not everyone is on board. They never are. Lindsay, talk about some of the resistance to this bill.
It's literally almost out of a comedy. So you've got these lawmakers who are defending low-income voters, saying, you know, the 10-cent charge is too much. Well, a simple solution to that is bring your own from home, which many people, certainly in LA County, do already and have for quite some time. The National Coalition of Plastic Bag Manufacturers is seeking a voter referendum to repeal the law. This is a state where 100 cities and counties already have these policies in place on their own. So it doesn't look like he may get much luck with that. The guy's leading that coalition anyway. The American Forest and Paper Association blasted the bill for charging customers what was once a free product. And now the American Progressive Bag Alliance, didn't know there was such thing as that, aired a commercial blasting this bill, saying that it's just a cash giveaway for grocers and that it would lead to thousands of lost manufacturing jobs. Well, there's a $2 million loan provision in this bill, handing them money to switch over their operations to make recycled products. So they need to keep in mind this is a state. It's one of the most progressive in the country. These are practices that are changing the law. This law isn't necessarily changing people's practices. This law is following a societal shift already in place.
It really is. It's a collective shift. It's hilarious. I can't imagine being part of that lobbying firm for the plastic industry and have to be fighting to get them reinstated. My God. Of course, it's the first state in the nation to ban them altogether. How many other states are pursuing similar measures, or are there any?
Well, already 3 major cities have: Chicago, Austin, and Seattle. Hawaii is on track for this. Hawaii's had a massive plastic bag problem for quite some time. Of course, out there is where you've got the the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The major states that have this, at least on the list of things to look at coming up, are Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and then we've got Puerto Rico. And as you said, I mean, in the signing, the governor said, we're not the first state to ban this. We won't be the last. It's time for these different groups to get on board with the way society is going with its consumerism. It's all about sustainability. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for breaking it down. Over the last few days, hundreds of presidents, prime ministers, and high-ranking diplomats descended on New York City for the United Nations General Assembly. Without a doubt, no world leader announced his presence to the American public louder than Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In between making bizarre Star Wars references at a rally in Central Park with Hugh Jackman and presiding over a 20,000-person spectacle at Madison Square Garden, Modi had time to meet with Obama to discuss everything from global trade policy to ISIS. But while the media fawns over Modi's rock star status while comparing him to Ronald Reagan, there's been nearly no discussion of his actual neoliberal economic policies and appalling human rights record as a government minister. So to delve deeper into Modi's first visit to the U.S., as well as other U.S. foreign policy issues, I was joined earlier by Vijay Prashad, an author and historian. I first asked him why Modi received such lavish treatment while he was in the U.S. compared to other world leaders.
Very large companies were involved financing this big event at Madison Square Garden, and their interest is very simple. They are looking forward to the fact that Mr. Modi is going to break down labor laws, give environmental waivers, and help Indian American firms and other firms enter the Indian market. In fact, I interviewed a businessman today who told me that he was so happy because Modi's, in power, and business is going to have a much easier time in India. Of course, much easier time means the workers will have a harder time.
You just wrote an op-ed in which you wrote, "For wealthy sections of Indian America, Modi represents a strong man who evokes pride. When Modi brags about his 56-inch chest, his machismo indicates India's a rival in world affairs." How does his outward demeanor relate to his actual policies for India?
Well, it's actually not just Modi. There's a strand of 21st century populism, which is about, the leader, and the leader being the one who, with his or her dynamic personality, is able to cut the Gordian knot, of all the many problems in the world. And he has played this extremely well. The previous Indian Prime Minister, who was also a so-called reformer, had a much more modest demeanor, spoke softly, etc. Modi arrived, with a personality that was on fire. He demanded attention, and he suggested that with his very charisma, he was going to solve all of India's problems. And this kind of 21st century populism is appealing to people because the problems are very difficult. They are grave. They require long-term solutions. They require a reasonable discussion. All this stuff was not to be there from Modi. So in his first 100 years, he's really attempted to push that 56-inch chest around. He's had his people, go out there and burn files that, that have information about the past in them. He's been delivering waivers of labor and environmental law. So he's been out there, putting himself forward as the solution. Of course, this is terrible for a democracy that's 1.3 billion people. You don't want to have one man be the solution. You want to have the ability of a government to create, institutional responses to help people solve their problems. And instead of that, of course, you have a fake kind of solution where the media has utterly gone along. The media loves him because they love the flamboyance, they love the kind of statements he makes, and this is very unfortunate for a sober approach to India's problems.
Right. They also love neoliberal policy, which he embraces wholeheartedly there. He also met with President Obama, where they discussed the threat of ISIS. I wanted to kind of transition over to something that you've also been very vocal about. Now that we're in the second week of the new war in Syria, we're starting to see the toll of civilian casualties, including a strike that killed 7 civilians, including 5 children, 2 days ago. Do you consider these strikes war crimes?
Of course, these strikes are war crimes. By the way, firstly, the strike itself, the U.S. strikes in Syria, are not authorized by anybody. There is no international authorization. In other words, there was not even an attempt to have a UN Security Council resolution. So it's very sketchy about their legality on international grounds. There was no attempt to have any kind of congressional oversight or any congressional discussion about these strikes. So it's unclear whether there's any national validation for it. Once again, you have a kind of personality politics. President Obama speaks. He says it's essential. He says that ISIS is a grave threat, and therefore he can bomb. I mean, this is the same kind of thing. Institutional power is set aside. Mr. Modi does this in India. Mr. Obama is doing it on a world stage. They've completely set aside international institutions. You go ahead, do what you want because you think it's the correct thing to do. And then, of course, civilians die. Now, it's not only a case of civilian death. There have been, I think, very credible reports that the Obama administration has told the military that whatever handcuffs they have, to beware of civilian casualties has been removed. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Kirby has said that he's not even sure the strikes are going to have an effect against ISIS.
Right. I wanted to jump in there because the White House just announced that new measure that you just kind of outlined, that airstrikes in Iraq and Syria don't have to adhere to the same standards as normal drone strikes. Of course, I think all of them are war crimes, but why should Syria and Iraq be exempt from these rules that would minimize civilian casualties?
Well, it's actually, there are 2 admissions of defeat already in this. The first admission of defeat is the United States, after 13 years, 11 years, has gone back to bombing in Iraq. That, I think, is something for people to consider. After considerable cost of both, human life, Iraqi life, American life, the life of the other coalition forces, immense, material cost as well, the United States is back to square one, back to shock and awe in Iraq. That's an admission of defeat. In Syria, the very fact that the United States has had to say, let's change our rules of engagement, let's allow for civilian casualties, demonstrates that defeat is on hand. In other words, they've understood that aerial bombardment is not going to get ISIS. The ISIS fighters have disappeared. They have vanished into civilian areas. They're not going to wait around, to be bombed from 30,000 feet. This is the reason why the government has to say, well, then let's go and bomb civilian areas. It's an admission that this strategy is a failure. You need to have a strategy on the ground to deal with the Islamic State, and the American government simply is not capable of creating an on-the-ground strategy.
Let's wrap this up. We have about a minute left, but I wanted to read a quote from a recent interview with Noam Chomsky, where he says, like Britain before it, the U.S. has tended to support radical Islam and to oppose secular nationalism, which both imperial states have regarded as more threatening to their goals of domination and control. When secular opinions are crushed, religious extremism often fills the vacuum, of course, tells a tale of what we've seen unfold in the Middle East. What's your reaction to that sentiment, and kind of what's the solution here with the U.S. out of the way?
Well, what Noam says there is absolutely true, and it applies as much to Israel, which has in its prisons people like Mr. Barghouti, who are committed nonviolent secular activists. Why does Israel keep nonviolent people in prison and then pretend that the Palestinian resistance is entirely Hamas? It's the same kind of game that all of them play. There's actually a simple pathway to not a solution in Syria, but to draw down the conflict. The two things that the American government, or three things, must do or should do or could do, but will not do because of their politics. One is to insist that Turkey close the border for the jihadi fighters to enter and to return for medical treatment. That should be the first thing that sane people call for. The second thing is a political solution in Syria. You have to close down the violence in Syria. But of course, the West is committed to increasing the violence. And the third thing is it's very important for Iran and Saudi Arabia to hold a serious discussion towards some kind of grand bargain, because it's too bad that this 30 to 40-year Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia has had such deleterious effects for the region. A grand bargain between these two important countries would go a long way toward cooling things down in a region that has been too hot for too long.
Thank you so much, Vijay Prashad, author of The Poor Nations. Always incredible insight.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to follow me on Twitter @AbbyMartin. Join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again. 1,000 people have been left without access to potable water simply because they were behind on their payments. This according to Detroit's Water and Sewage Department. Now, city officials claim that the shutoffs are necessary because of the dire financial situation of the local economy, as Detroit recently filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. To them, the logic is simple. If you can't pay your bills, then you shouldn't get water. Well, a short-lived moratorium put a stop to mass shutoffs earlier this summer, but only after a wave of protests as well as widespread condemnation from groups like the NAACP, Amnesty International, and even the UN, which said that cutting water to the poorest residents of Detroit is a violation of human rights. But with little being done to fix the problem, grassroots organizations have been working hard to empower residents from the ground up. One such activist is Makita Taylor of the Detroit Water Brigade, who says that not thinking of water as a human right is beyond comprehension.
Anyone who would equate a life with a payment of a bill, that's just really difficult for me to understand. I wouldn't teach my children that. That if someone is hungry, you leave them hungry because they don't have food, or if someone needs a life survival, something that keeps them alive, you're going to deny them that because of a piece of paper called money. I really find that difficult to understand. But I do know that there are people in the world who feel that way. And, what can you do about that? Is that the predominant attitude of most Americans? That's the question that I've been asking.
Taylor's organization has been so successful in raising awareness about the plight of thousands of underprivileged Detroiters that it's captured the support of at least one U.S. lawmaker. In response to the crisis, Michigan Congressman John Conyers said actions that deny residents the ability to bathe, hydrate, or prepare meals for themselves and their families create costly, long-term public health challenges. These water cutoffs are not only inhumane, but economically short-sighted. What's up, everyone? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. As the media shifts its focus from ISIS militants to Ebola to George Clooney's wedding, people seem to have largely forgotten about a dire human rights situation in another corner of the world. Guantanamo Bay Prison is still holding 149 men indefinitely. 143 of them have never been levied charges nor faced trial and have been rotting behind concrete walls for years. Historically, the only avenue for prisoners to get attention to their struggle is by going on a hunger strike. And there have already been 2 mass hunger strikes at the prison, the second involving up to 106 prisoners at its height in 2013. This, plus news that at least 45 of the men were being routinely force-fed, propelled the story into international headlines, causing the government to re-strategize. So they turned to euphemisms, calling it a long Guantanamo Bay. Look, the same judge has already shown where her allegiance lies by preventing the release of the classified tapes of the force feedings. Clearly, there's a lot to hide here. And this latest measure is just another move to silence the plight of these men. But if public pressure continues to mount, they can't keep this egregious practice in the shadows forever. Let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set.
Since March of this year, the city of Detroit has been rocked by an underreported human rights crisis, See an estimated 22-term non-religious fast. Furthermore, daily briefs were no longer issued concerning the amount of men on the strike, and tapes of the dehumanizing procedure remain classified. Force-feeding prisoners is considered a violation of international law under the Tokyo Convention. And according to Yemeni prisoner Ahmad Hassan, the process is akin to torture. He describes that detainees are strapped in what's called a torture chair, given laxatives while being force-fed excess liquid through oversized tubes that are repeatedly shoved through their nostrils. Now, after deafening silence on behalf of Guantanamo officials and the White House about this daily violation of medical ethics, Obama's finally asked a judge to hold a long-awaited hearing on the procedure. Big problem, though. Mr. Transparency wants it all done in secret. Because national security. According to The Guardian, should the judge approve the government's request, the first major legal battle over force feeding in a federal court would be less transparent than the military commissions that